Long before there were maps or compasses or any idea of what lay beyond the next horizon, human beings were already on the move. They crossed mountains that hadn't been named. They followed rivers that had no endpoint on any chart. They pushed into deserts, forests, and frozen tundra with nothing but what they could carry and what they already knew. And somehow, over thousands of years, they populated every corner of the earth. Not just the easy parts, all of it. The islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 3,000 miles from the nearest continent. The Arctic, where winter lasts most of the year and temperatures drop low enough to kill an unprotected person in hours. The rainforests of South America, the highlands of New Guinea. Every single place where humans now live, some group of ancient people got there first, on foot or by water, with no technology we would recognize today. So how did they do it? The answer turns out to be one of the most remarkable stories in all of human history, and it starts about 70,000 years ago on the African continent. Genetic evidence tells us that at some point around that time, a small group of modern humans left Africa through what is now Ethiopia and crossed into the Arabian Peninsula. We don't know exactly how many people made that crossing. Some estimates put it as low as a few hundred individuals. But from that tiny seed, the rest of the human world grew. The first tool these travelers had was their feet. This sounds obvious, but it's worth sitting with for a moment. Before horses were domesticated, before anyone had built a wheel, before boats existed in any recognizable form, the default mode of human travel was walking. And ancient humans walked extraordinary distances. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups, the communities whose way of life most closely mirrors our deep past, show that people routinely covered 15 to 20 miles a day while following seasonal food sources. A group moving at that pace with no particular urgency could travel from one end of a continent to another inside a few generations. Archaeologists have found stone tools in the Australian outback that date back 65,000 years. That means people walked out of Africa, across the Middle East and South Asia, all the way to the edge of the known world, and then somehow crossed the water to a continent no human had ever set foot on, in a time frame that, geologically speaking, is almost nothing. Which brings us to the first great mystery of ancient travel, the crossing to Australia. At no point in prehistory was there a land bridge connecting mainland Asia to Australia the way there was between Siberia and Alaska. Even during the last ice age, when sea levels dropped significantly because so much water was locked in glaciers, there was still a gap of open ocean between what is now Indonesia and the Australian landmass. Crossing it required boats, or at minimum rafts, and the people who made that crossing had to do it intentionally. You can't accidentally drift to Australia on a log and survive. This means that 65,000 years ago, human beings were already building watercraft, navigating open water, and making deliberate voyages to places they could barely see on the horizon. We have no physical evidence of those boats because wood and bamboo don't survive tens of thousands of years. But the people who arrived in Australia are proof enough that the boats existed. As the millennia passed, ancient humans developed a growing toolkit of navigational knowledge. And the most important thing to understand about this knowledge is that it wasn't written down anywhere. It lived in people's heads, passed from generation to generation through stories, songs, and rituals. Pacific Islander navigators, some of the greatest seafarers the ancient world produced, memorized star maps of extraordinary complexity. They knew which stars rose over which islands at which times of years. They read the ocean swells the way a modern pilot reads instruments, feeling through the hull of the canoe how deep underwater ridges deflected wave patterns, inferring the presence of land still beyond the visual horizon. They tracked the flight paths of birds, the color changes in the water, the smell of vegetation carried on the wind. They built and sailed double-hulled outrigger canoes capable of making open ocean voyages of thousands of miles, and they colonized islands spread across the largest ocean on Earth with an accuracy that staggers modern researchers. Hawaiian navigators sailing from the Marquesas Islands covered more than 2,000 miles of open Pacific Ocean without any instrument other than their trained senses and accumulated knowledge. They arrived at the Hawaiian Islands, one of the most isolated archipelagos on the planet, and they did it not once but repeatedly, establishing trade routes and cultural connections across distances that most people today would hesitate to fly. On land, the navigational methods were different but equally sophisticated. Across Central Australia, indigenous communities maintained what are called song lines, intricate networks of oral geography that encoded the landscape into music. A song wasn't just a song, it was a map. The melody described the terrain, the landmarks, the water sources, the seasonal changes of a specific route across the continent. Someone who knew the song could navigate the desert using it as a guide, even if they had never physically traveled that particular path before. The land itself was the library, and the stories people told about it were the index. In the Arctic, Inuit communities developed a navigational system built around wind and snow. The prevailing winds in the Arctic blow consistently from specific directions, and they carve the snow into patterns called sastrugi, long ridges that run parallel to the wind. An experienced traveler could read the orientation of the sastrugi the way a sailor reads a compass. Combined with knowledge of star positions, animal migration routes, and ice conditions, this gave Arctic peoples reliable navigation even during the periods of continuous polar night when no sun appeared for months at a time. The journey into the Americas is its own extraordinary chapter. Around 20,000 years ago, possibly earlier, groups of people crossed the land bridge that connected Siberia to what is now Alaska, a bridge that existed because Ice Age sea levels had dropped enough to expose the floor of the Bering Sea. These crossings happened gradually, probably not as a single migration, but as a series of movements by different groups over many generations. And from that entry point, people spread south and east across 2 entire continents with remarkable speed. By 11,000 years ago, humans had reached the southern tip of South America, the farthest point you can travel overland from the Arctic entry point, more than 10,000 miles away. What drove all of this movement? Several things worked together. Climate shifts forced populations to follow the animals and plants they depended on for survival. Growing populations pushed groups into new territories. Curiosity played a role too, because the archaeological record suggests that ancient humans weren't just wandering randomly. They were actively exploring, systematically mapping their environments and extending their knowledge of what lay beyond the familiar. And knowledge accumulated. Each generation inherited not just the routes their ancestors had traveled, but the lessons learned along the way. Which plants were safe to eat in unfamiliar environments? Which mountain passes opened in summer and closed in winter? Where fresh water could be found in landscapes that looked dry from a distance? This accumulated geographic intelligence was as valuable as any physical tool, and it traveled with the people who carried it in their memories. By 10,000 years ago, humans had done something that no other large animal had accomplished. They had colonized virtually every habitable environment on Earth, from the tropics to the poles, from sea level to high altitude, using nothing but their own movement, their watercraft, their accumulated knowledge, and their capacity to adapt to conditions that would have been lethal to almost any other species. The maps didn't come first. The people did. And the maps we draw today are just our attempt to trace the routes they already knew by heart.